Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses this afternoon. My question is for Ms. Reed. We've heard from a number of witnesses over the course of this week who have expressed reservations about any kind of net zero strategy that isn't simply a reduction in emissions. And I think it would be fair to say that for a lot of people, the kind of emission reduction strategy you're describing is almost seen, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think like a form of cheating, that somehow it's not taking away emissions, so therefore it doesn't count. So I wondered if you could explain for us how we can legitimately count and sort of do an analysis of to what extent Nature Conservancy is actually reducing our overall greenhouse gas situation. I mean, I think about the fact my family owns a quarter section that's been in our family for a long time, and a big chunk of it is wetlands. I mean, it's slough, as we call it here on the prairies, not swamp. We never do anything with it because we have 160 acres and we're really only using 60 of them. So if 100 of them are underwater, that's cool with us. But surely we ought not to get points for our sloth. And I mean, nobody's giving out the Paula Simons Wetland Preservation Prize because I'm just too lazy to think of a thing to do with my wetland.
Thank you for the question. I'm sure your wetland is very pretty, and I would love to visit it someday.
But the moose like it. That's about what I can say for it. The moose and the mosquitoes.
There you go. So absolutely, fundamentally, when you think of the hundreds of megatons of emissions that we need to reduce to meet the 2030 targets, let alone net zero, a huge portion of that has to come from transitioning away from fossil fuels, energy efficiency, clean transportation, et cetera. That absolutely has to be the bulk of the transition. But nature and the natural climate solutions that I described also have a very important role to play. And so there's two buckets of how that plays. And at Nature United, the study that we looked at, all the pathways are additional. And so they're not counting business as usual. They're additional and reduce emissions beyond business as usual. So the first is, if we continue to convert intact forests to high intensity cropland and intact grasslands to high intensity croplands, that will emit additional emissions into the air. So by protecting those, we are actively reducing emissions that will occur and be seen by the atmosphere every year. And so when I told you those numbers, those are based on current rates of conversion over the last 10 years. So those are actually reducing emissions that we know will be released into the atmosphere because of the level of activity that we have in Canada. The other part is sequestering, and that is the net, and that is taking emissions that are already in the atmosphere and taking them out of the atmosphere. And really, you get to that through restoration of natural areas that currently aren't absorbing carbon. You increase their ability to do that. And so tree planting is a great example. Baby trees don't really sequester a lot of carbon. You need to wait 30 years until they're mature and their processes are working to really get that carbon absorption. And so those processes are really important that we put into place now so that you have those net reductions out in 2050. And, there's always going to be emissions that we can't reduce from building materials that we will still use, or, so to the extent that we transition away from fossil fuels to the maximum extent possible and do all of these other things, will always be unavoidable emissions. They'll take a while to get those emissions. And also, we already have a high level of emissions in the atmosphere. And so those sequestration is just helping us transition and helping us get to net zero from those emissions that are just really very hard or impossible to negate.
I guess my question is, so how do you measure? How do you account for it? I mean, how do you know how much carbon a new growth forest is sequestering? How much carbon is removed if you take what had been a canola field and return it to pasture for cattle?
So there's two elements of it. One is the actual carbon flux from that like biophysical process. And there is research out there of how much a wetland can absorb in carbon. And you know, scientists, I'm not a scientist, so they've been able to measure that. There are data gaps. There's still more science you can do on that very specific. What is the flux from this natural process to get the uncertainty rates down? Then when you look at it, so that's on the flux of like how much actually does a tree or a wetland carbon does it store? And then when you look at how do changes in practices change our sources and sinks of emissions, there's complex modeling that you use to do that. And that's based on rates of change. So, in the forest sector, what is the demand from forest products from that region? What is the historical rates of logging and conversion? And then you kind of multiply that by then that carbon flux. And so you have a very complex scientific and accounting model to figure that out.
As a senator from Alberta, I'm particularly happy to see Dr. Agnew here, waving the flag for Olds College, which is a very important Alberta educational institution. Dr. Agnew, I think when people think about the carbon footprint of agriculture or the methane footprint of agriculture, they think about things like, grain drying at great volume or cows producing methane in the way that cows produce methane. But since you are the director of the Center of Applied Research and Innovation, I wondered if you could tell us some of the more innovative techniques or equipment or procedures that you're seeing young farmers experimenting with that could reduce and offset carbon.
Thank you, Senator Simons, for the question and the shout out for Olds College. So before I talk about some of the innovations and technologies that your question addressed, I wanted to point out the fact that there is a lot of misinformation out there as well with respect to the carbon footprint of agriculture and specifically the livestock sector, where yes, cattle do result in methane emissions, but the methane that is emitted is typically part of a short carbon cycle where that carbon is sequestered that year and then consumed by the animals in the following grazing cycle. So the net emissions of carbon to the atmosphere from cattle production is far lower than many people believe based on poorly presented study results, in my opinion. But to answer your question more directly around technologies and innovations that are helping to reduce overall emissions, that there are so many, it's so numerous, I can barely even know where to start. But we're talking about novel feed additives for the cattle industry that are then reducing the enteric emissions from the animals. There are novel sensors and algorithms and machine learning and artificial intelligence that are helping to optimize in-bin grain drying processes. So you're only running fans and heaters and burning propane and natural gas for the shortest amount of time required to achieve safe to store moisture content conditions. We are seeing massive advances in the use of precision ag tools to ensure that only the right amount and right type of nitrogen fertilizer and other fertilizers are being applied to grow the crops with maximum yield. It goes on and on and on. The opportunities are endless. The challenge is that some practices, or I guess some methods of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, again, aren't aligned with the way that we do business in agriculture. And I'm referring to the fact that sometimes there aren't alternative practices to adopt. And that can severely inhibit or limit our ability to grow enough food to feed a growing population.
Follow-up question, Senator Simons?
Yes, please. So can you go into a little more detail when you say things are not aligned? I mean, I'm sensing from your comments that you're almost concerned that individual farmers are going to have to be reporting in. I mean, there's nothing really in C-12 that is that prescriptive. But what are your concerns about practices that you don't think with the technology, or at least the procedures we have now, that can be made to have that kind of drastic drop in emissions.
Thank you for the follow-up question. So yes, I recognize that Bill C-12 won't require farmers to individually document and report on emissions. I guess I'm referring to mechanisms like the carbon tax, for example, where farmers are being penalized, so to speak, for burning fuel for grain drying and other practices that aren't exempt, where there is no alternative for them to have a lower carbon footprint. And that's one example of a policy or a regulation or a mechanism that's deployed to encourage alternative management practices to reduce a carbon footprint that just aren't aligned with the way that we do business. Agriculture is a business with incredibly razor thin margins, and farmers and ranchers are constantly having to manage risk very carefully. And in order to do that, they can't be burdened by additional costs of doing business without any opportunity, I guess, to recover that down the supply chain. And they also have to remain competitive with other nations. And if other nations don't have the same type of climate policies that affect agriculture production, then it makes our Canadian farmers, it'll make it very difficult for them to compete.